I live out in the country and I have two internet connections. I have Starlink.
So does this mean, Gillian, you're coming to us via satellite?
I am coming to you via satellite.
Do you know, I've always wanted to say that. I didn't realize it'd be the second episode we'd be able to say live via satellite. We've got Gillian Power, which is pretty cool.
Welcome to CTIO 101 Business Technology Simplified and Shared. Episode 2, Balancing People, Process, and Technology, the core challenge of any business technology professional.
You never know. You could be our person across the pond, as it were, as we like to say in the UK.
Our foreign correspondent in the Midwest.
People, process, technology. For me, that was a bit of a frying pan in the face moment. My really early days of joining some management consultancy firm beginning with an A many years ago. And people said, oh, John, it's all about people, process, technology. And it really light bulb moment. I didn't realize that the term actually, I think, goes back to the 1960s.
The hill to climb to solve for people and process makes for a sales approach by vendors that is all too enticing. Buy this product and all of these other problems will go away. There's always an inherent analysis deficit that many businesses have. The quality and the depth of their business analysis means that they don't know how to tackle big systemic problems. And a vendor will come along and say, we've solved this in other companies just like yours. So if you purchase this and put it in, and there's just enough configuration and bells and whistles, then you can solve these problems. And people view it and say, this is simple. It's a seduction, right? It's the siren song of the technology. And I've found myself in many instances as the lead technologist arguing against buying technology.
That's brilliant.
Which is a bit of a sublime irony. And I think there's a huge amount to unpack to say, why does this occur? What's the organizational psychology, the business psychology that results in these situations? Because one sees it repeated over and over again, and I think there's a lot of factors behind it.
Gillian, there is so much going on in those 500 words you just said. Having been myself in a sales role, sales and delivery, I think if you think about how systematic you and I are as lead technologists, and we look at a situation, we look at how we can solve it. I think in technology sales, there's a similar process that goes on. But remember, the outcome for the salesperson is the sale, which is subtly different because the outcome for the lead technologist is happy business, great matching of people, process, tech, etc. And so if you've got a sector that suffers from a lack of sort of process knowledge, or maybe a lack of how technology can enable that, I think, if I could be a bit cynical, I think the sales process might be designed to exploit that a little bit. I wrote down the phrase snake oil when you first started talking about that seductive nature. And if you had a cynical eye, you could look at a particular setup and say, look, they'll definitely buy this up from us because they don't really know quite what their problem is. Our product has enough promise to get them further than they've thought, but the whole sector has this, to quote you, this analysis deficit. Now, that's a really cynical approach. I would say that when I had my sales hat on, you don't want to sell something and then be public enemy number one for the next 3 years as the company that you sold to looks at it and goes, this is completely pointless. The other view might be that the salesperson is trying to create value, but there is that space where it can be exploited. And I'm just wondering, do you feel that technology sales, sometimes they exploit that and maybe they're getting support, that the lead technologist is not being involved at the beginning? You were talking about having to be the person that talks against technology. Somehow you're positioned as the bad guy. You're no longer putting the solution together, but actually what you are doing is just bringing into play the laws of physics.
So there certainly are organizations, and we don't need to name them, that I think are relatively unethical in the way that they go about that. Let's bring it back down to fundamentals. How many times have you been faced with, let's say, a difficult piece of communication? The hardest work is to start the first draft, and everybody else who gets to critique it afterwards, it's always infinitely easier to critique someone else's work than to initiate it. And And I think this is what happens in a lot of organizations, that they have a problem. Company comes along and says, we have this software or this solution that is going to solve this particular business problem. And in essence, the buyers don't have to be creators. They can just be critiquers of it. And then the lead technologist is in this situation where you go, what do I know about my organization and the people and process? And how close is the solution to getting to most of their needs versus how much adaptation or change management is going to have to go into it to really get it to embed and be successful, right? To be well received. But I think that there's always a gross overestimation of the success of many software deployments because we don't have robust tools to actually track their utilization.
Yes.
And on the other side of it. And then that's not being fed back into the post-project analysis to understand where the solution has fallen short. But everyone's so exhausted after the giant deployment, and they've pushed out so many other business problems that they end up just living with it.
Yeah, and you get to that moment where the project or program just has this sort of fairly negative momentum because, again, people just want to get it done. Folks are no longer, everyone's thinking about moving on. So in practical terms, someone's listening to this. This is happening to me right now. Is there anything practical you and I could suggest to them from the experience we've had to say it might not be, this might be unstoppable for them, depending on their position in the organization? So I suppose there's advice that says, can you stop it? And then there's advice that says, can you make it as good as it can possibly be? Or what's the advice we give, Julian, to, I'm just trying to think of all the different elements. My instincts have always been to try and get more around the relationship that the sales company is forming with the rest of the business, because they do make these promises, don't they? And the business is, look, the software does all the rest. It's just incredible. And the point is, technically, they could be correct, because if 1,015 things happen in an exact sequence, then yes, you could deliver exactly what the software company is purporting to sell. So it's that, how do you get in, and how do you get in without ending up being criticized, or the business might say, we've got to do something. It's quite a tricky, it's quite a risky place to go, isn't it? When you try and insert yourself there. So what sort of advice could we give?
Number one, it depends on the phase and where it's at. It also depends on the size of your business and the amount of leverage that you have over the product relative to its maturity as well. I think so you can live on the early adopter side of the curve, and that's an incredible opportunity to influence the product development to your favor, right? Because the developers are trying to understand the processes in order to develop the product, and you get to exert influence on what gets prioritized in the development stream. So that's certainly one side of the influence. You can always slow something down.
Yeah.
Invariably, you can find a way to slow it down. And once you slow it down, there's the opportunity to break it into phases. And I think the opportunity there is that you can get feedback from smaller groups, that you can feed back into the deployment. And whether that's asking the vendor to make some tweaks, maybe you've got developer consultants that are helping you with the implementation. Maybe you need to make some workload changes, something along those lines, or you can refine your training and change management.
Yes.
All right. So that's time is probably one of the best things. I am a big believer in using outside consultants to help run your RFP process for you for the big things, the big fish projects, and because there really is a degree of insulation. And what I've written into RFP or RFI agreements is that I've added language to say that all communications can only be with the consultant. The vendors pitching may only liaise with the consultants, and any attempt to circumvent that could result in their disqualification. So the other thought, if you can swing this, is to say everything presented in product demos and everything that's told has to be in writing, and it must be delivered. So that constrains the salespeople immediately from making promises that don't exist.
Yes.
And I think the other piece to it is, another condition is record all the demos.
Yeah.
It's trivial to do that now. Record and transcribe all the demos. because you're just trying to move it towards honesty.
Yes. Do you think also that we tend to rush in with the product when even way before the product, we might want to spend a bit more time on design? So let's say we've got our product, which is being presented to us. And indeed, it has got lots and lots of, it's highly configurable. In a previous episode, talking to a CTO, and I was saying that I'm a bit terrified of the blank sheet of paper, because I'm not actually convinced that there really is corporate memory in any organization that really understands what the here and now as is operational processes. It's very rare you find someone who knows really what it is end to end. If you just banned the technology completely and said no tech for 4 weeks, we're just going to sit down and work out what's the outcome and what is the process to achieve that outcome. And if we want to keep it people process for now, what are the folks involved? Why is that process worth doing, either like everyone else does it, i.e. buy a process that's already made, or is this a process that actually we want to make uniquely ours? I think your point you were making, Gillian, is people dive into tech. They don't really dive into people process. And if you put people process together, that is operational strategy, operational management, that side. So maybe maybe what we should do is say, let's design that first and then go looking.
Put it one way, the soft stuff is actually the hard stuff. The stuff that is all soft skills and meetings and conversations and focus groups, etc. That's the stuff that produces the most value. What is a piece of technology in an organization? It's nothing but a complex sociological phenomenon, right? Because it's the tool that people are using every single day. We hope they're using it every day, that they're using to get their work done under the pressures that they're experiencing, which are often not pressures that the technologists understand. So approaching it really as a sociological experiment, as a sociological study, is going to put you in a position for the maximum success, because you understand the sentiment, you understand the emotion around the current tools, the current processes that people are working on. Sometimes it can be what could appear to be the most trivial thing, that you take something that's repetitive, that requires 7 steps, and suddenly it takes 2 in the new application. And we should never underestimate the power of something like that.
Yes.
So many people are toiling away at lives of unexpressed misery. You can make that better. You can make those things, you can really make those things better, but it starts with listening.
You talked about going from 7 steps to 2. We go from 7 steps to 2 so we can create capacity to do more within the business. So it's creative automation. It's not reductive, destructive automation. And so again, if we just leave the technology to one side and we look at the work we're doing at the moment, we must be able to analyze work to say, look, that is not value adding work. And it's also, to your point, Gillian, it's not value adding and it's soul destroying. It's the two together. It's to create this really rich experience at work. But actually, this population that's working in this sort of very automated, repetitive task space, they've always wanted to get into this area, or we could really get ahead of the competition if only we had more time to work on X. It's creating that space. And so that opportunity to automate then moves us forwards, because one of the things I wrote down when you did people process tech, I added a few extra items to it. So I added the words data, I added the words commercials, compliance, regulations. Now, obviously, you can relate any of those into the triad of people process tech, but breaking some of those out. What actually happens to people process once it's fully automated? Who's owning it then? At the moment, we're at this point, aren't we, which is we're automating manual process still, and there's massive amounts to come. But pretty soon, there'll be elements of our business, and I've done a little bit of this, where we're automating almost second generation. So we're going into what we've already automated and then improving it. I'm just wondering, where does the center of gravity start to move when you've got straight through automated processing? Does that mean that the technology influencers, as you called them, Gillian, this is a great expression, is it coming towards us, or is operations? Do you see what I mean? There's an inherent assumption into people process tech, which is the word people. But if you are completely automated in a certain area of your business, then you've suddenly got process tech, or maybe the people bit is more on the beginning and the end of the black box process.
Automated processes are inherently rigid and therefore fragile. So your goal from a people point of view is to upskill or replace, if you have to, the people who are managing the business processes in a way that they can be more finely calibrated to whatever the business needs are, the shifts in the business needs, right? And they have enough command of the automation technology that they can make those calibrations quickly enough that you don't end up with a broken process. Because you can have a manual process that's broken, you can have an automated process that's broken. The probability of that is how many resources you have redeployed to being constantly attuned to the changes in the business needs to alter those processes.
Yeah.
Your automated processes have to be highly adaptive as well. Just because you've automated doesn't mean it stays, right? The scripts don't make sense, and there's always inherent deviation from whatever that point is, that point in time when you set the automation.
An automated process is actually quite fragile, because that you no longer have the person who can, human beings are just incredible things that can understand, change, adapt, etc. If you've got all of that embedded in a set of repeatable steps with some sort of logic in it, but it's going to have nowhere near the flexibility or the nuance of a human, then, that presents a problem. There's a concept, I'm pretty certain I've pinched this from somewhere else, but since we've been automating, I've come up with the expression at work, which I call the bad robot. And what I'm defining a bad robot is, this is where we've put some end-to-end automation in place. Yeah. And from a technologist's point of view, we can monitor that things are, they're working, the processing's there, the memory's there, the system is actually up. However, what the automation is actually producing is wrong. Do you see what I mean? So if you looked at it from a tech eyes, there's nothing wrong with it. Everything's running, it's on, it doesn't need switching off and on again, that kind of thing, it's there. But the logic in it is producing the wrong stuff, which I call bad robot. And it's really interesting because that's actually quite difficult to monitor, because we're used to in tech monitoring whether something's on. We're not used to saying, oh, hang on a minute, the outcome of this process doesn't make sense. So I'm just wondering, you talk about that fragility of an automated process, that we've somehow got to get our heads around this bad robot thing. How do we start monitoring automation to say that what it's producing is actually what we need and what we're expecting?
It's an unbelievably pernicious problem, because there's such a drive to reduce labor and replace with robots. But robots are inherently dumb. There are zero intelligent processes out there. I haven't heard of anybody who's applied some magic AI to cause processes to be self-calibrating or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So you still need humans to monitor the robots.
Yes.
I did a tour of a Ford manufacturing plant a few years ago. There's 3 phases to building a car. There's chassis, paint, and then there's engine and trim, if you really want to break it down. All the robots are on the first 2. So it's all automated welding, putting the chassis together, and it's all automated painting. Thereafter, it's humans are putting all the wires in, they're fitting all the trim, they're doing all of those other pieces. And the reason that they can do that is because you can define to unbelievable levels of tolerances where a robot should be, and then in terms of space and time, if you like. But there's no robot who can go and put wire harnesses into the dashboard of a car. You just can't, because every single time there has to be some degree of calibration. It's very close. The tolerances are very close, but still, humans are still adaptive. So I think the cure for the bad robots is to recognize that good robots are the result of a sort of almost a cybernetic relationship between the people who are operating the robots and the robots operating themselves.
Yes.
And that requires a class of person who understands the business and also understands the automations.
Yes.
Because without that, they cannot be responsive to recalibrate. when there's changes.
Yes.
Or even to take it back to the policy committee.
Yeah.
Or whoever the process governance committee, whoever it is, and to say, we're actually getting a deviation from expected business outcomes.
Yes.
Because the inputs are changing.
The phrase artificial intelligence, but it's almost becoming a bit like digital, very sort of misunderstood, and it taken on like a almost like a marketing meaning rather than a defined meaning. So for me, it's more around the quantitative research, the stuff that's actually 30 or 40 years old as a discipline, which is more about helping you make decisions rather than magic. And then you've got this phrase of the human in the loop, being able to listen in or look at the probability, or the quantitative research is saying, I'm 90% certain that this particular case should flow through this direction. And that's giving the human support, because it means that they can look at it. It's almost like it's been pre-sorted for them. And that's automation that's aimed at making the human's job a lot easier. Or it's still like you're talking about this relationship between the human and the machine. The change is happening so quickly. This is also a cliche, isn't it? It's happening exponentially. And that's that phrase, the rate of change that we're experiencing right now is the slowest it will ever be in our lifetime, because it's just getting faster and faster. If you take the business, whatever the average business is, whatever that is, in 5 years from now, is it going to be possible to be a CEO without having a CIO or CTO understanding?
Impossible. Or they have to be exceptionally well briefed and they have to listen. But inherently, they have to have a process and systems mindset. Let's put it that way. Because if you just step back and you look at any business and the supply chain complexity that they exist within, if you cannot be a systems thinker and you cannot see the dynamic interrelationships behind the existence of your business entity,
yes,
you can't operate it.
Yes. Have we got a renaissance coming ahead of us? I don't think you get a lot of crossover between someone who's a CIO and they become the CEO. And I'm wondering, Gillian, if that relates right back to the beginning of the conversation, where somehow our positions, we're like we view the business almost like we're examining the business, but we're not quite in it, because we've got to take a step back to look at it. And I'm wondering if by taking that step back, we've seen it somehow as distinct or different or separate from the business. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to work out what does our profession need to do in the next 5 years for us to start to be appointed as CEOs? What's going to make Gillian CEO 5 years from now? Which, by the way, I've absolutely no doubt will happen.
Thank you. You could, again, bring it back to the fundamentals. How can you relate the net present value of money to the application of technology? Ultimately, what is the CEO other than someone who understands the application of NPV, right? Because they're making choices about the deployment of capital and the returns on that capital. So for a CIO to be a CEO, they have to be able to talk in terms of the application of capital and the returns that it can produce.
The complexity of some of these business cases and the major technology purchases, there's a lot that goes into that gives the CIO, CTO a commercial angle. How are we going to help lead the people element? Because we've talked about a future where existing tasks are automated. People are going to move into an evolving role in business. Is there a people element? I think the net present value of money and the return on investment and where do we need to make our choices about where to put capital? I think, I get all of that. But I'm just trying to think about the leadership element. Who are we leading into this new space?
So it's actually occurring in many organizations, and the vehicle that it's occurring through is Agile in a very large extent. So I don't think it's the only thing. But if you look at how Agile has moved from software development into being within the business, there's one of the best examples of how IT leadership has literally infiltrated. It's an insurgency in many regards. Right.
Yes.
It's been born out of fundamental insights and realizations about the way that the world is working at the interface between carbon and silicon.
Yes.
The Agile movement, as it grew out of software development, was a set of fundamental realizations about the way that human systems get translated back and forth between digital systems in the context of business, of developing business value. And those fundamental set of insights have transformed entire businesses in the way that they're operating.
Yeah.
It's undermined hierarchical organizational structures. It's moved into matrixed organizations, project-based people organizations. We're at the forefront of reducing presenteeism and delivering the tools that's allowing for asynchronous work, all of these things. But your question is, how is that transformation made? I think in terms of, let's call them old economy businesses, I actually think that there's probably very little space for a CIO or CTO to make that transition to CEO. I think the reality is, if that's your desire, if that's one's desire, you have to go form another business. The retrofit is too difficult and too expensive.
Well, one of the key success factors with Agile is just having a really decent product design or vision. And when I say product vision, I don't mean we're going to be number one in X industry next year, the really obvious stuff. It's that thing that sort of says, we're going to achieve this, and we're going to achieve it specifically by doing the following, and we're going to have the best X and the best Y, and we're going to serve these customers. You're really getting into specifics. And then the bit that in a hierarchical organization is, okay, let's all go home now. We've done the vision. You know what I mean? We've got our objectives set for the year. Let's see how we do. I think Agile then says, okay, now let's slice that up. Let's do the iteration. But I think if you do the iteration straight off, you can end up with a design that's not really grounded. There's still space for some really insightful design work up front. Folks who, look, I know this sector, I know this business, I know this type of law if you're in the legal sector, I know how to make cars, but this is the vision. And then you execute it. Do you see what I mean? It's almost, there's that kind of core self-assurance of, this is what we're going to do, and then let rip with Agile. But if you don't have that, you'll end up with the kind of classic massive backlog, huge excitement at the beginning, and then it gets a bit rudderless.
100%. And it made me think that there's probably a blend between the IDEO design pipeline and Agile, in that there's a pre-stage of rapid experimentation, of broad-ranging experimentation that is not necessarily objective directed.
Yeah.
But from that gets selected down into that product vision, and then gets handed over to Agile development. I don't think you can quite sit down in a conference room in the course of 4 weeks. And if you haven't done that, what's the word for it, where that free associative design phase is still inherent, but that has to be coalesced, but not coalesced to the point that it's rigid. Once there's a tacit agreement on the direction and vision, then you can allow Agile to refine it.
We were talking about strategy as to whether it emerges or whether it comes to you in a flash. Obviously, we landed on a bit of both, but actually the coming to you in a flash is that moment of clarity that you get. But if you don't do this precursor work and the design, etc., you might never ever get that moment of clarity. You might end up in almost like an Escher drawing. You're just iterating, but never getting there.
Yeah. I remember as a kid being utterly transfixed on the formation of crystals and solutions.
That's amazing. Right. I did as well. The blue one. Are you talking about copper sulfate?
Are you
talking about like the chemistry sets we used to get and used to put a bit of, I used to do that.
Yeah.
Anyone listening who's maybe born in the last 2 or 3 decades might not know what we're talking about, but yes, we used to mess around with chemicals frequently. You used to get them for Christmas.
Yeah, toxic chemicals are that. To form a crystal out of solution, you have to create a supersaturated solution where you're dissolving a very high amount of the copper sulfate in the solution. And then you have to introduce a piece of string, which the crystals can then form around in order to crystallize. So I think about that, the IDEO design pipeline as that free-form association, early phase design is that process of saturating the solution. And then you start introducing the elements around which the crystals can start forming. And the ideas are literally crystallizing.
That's such a cool analogy. Right. And just if I can build on your analogy that you just put, the vision is we're going to make a crystal. You know what I mean? So there is there is an idea of what we're going to do, and then how you create it. That's I thought I was good at analogies. I've never done an analogy that involves chemistry and computer science and agile thinking. Yeah, so I think that's a first.
What is leadership other than the ability to usher in phase transitions?
Yes.
If I can go back into physics a bit more, phase transitions for me are much like electrons moving to the next quanta, to the next electron orbit. There's a defined amount of energy that's required to make that phase transition, right, for the electron.
Yeah.
But even at a macro level, what you're doing is ushering in phase transitions, because you're transforming one set of things to the next. And in that transformation, you're creating value.
Let's just do some people process technology cliches, because it is a cliche, isn't it? And people mention PPT a lot. When I was first introduced to it, it's the classic Venn diagram with the overlaps and all the rest of it. And the way I'm wired is I always wanted to build on it. I hate it when someone says it's these three things. I go, there must be a fourth. Mm-hmm. So if you had to pick one additional circle to try and fit into that Venn, I used to say commercials, but I think that's because I was in a sales mindset. So I always used to think about people, process, technology, and the commercial deal. That was the fourth for me. I think there's another world where you could say people, process, tech, and data. Maybe.
Yes,
I think
possibly.
Data might have a bit of a... And then there was that point we said earlier, which was if you've got very significant automation, then the people and the process bit has a slightly different dynamic. There's a big change there, isn't there? Because the assumption with people process is people are operating a process and it's being enabled by technology. Maybe that still stands. It's just with automation, it's in a way that just couldn't have been imagined in the 1960s when the phrase people process technology was first born. But if you have, so Gillian, you've got to pick a fourth one, and you're not allowed to pick data because I've just done that. What's your fourth to throw in?
Let's think of it in terms of the factory floor, right, as the place of manufacturing. You can set up any production line that applies people and process and technology to produce an output to do that. That is inherently two-dimensional. It's flat in a sense. And I think your point about data is really adding another dimension to it. I'll give you one point of the pyramid, which is data, which is really essentially measuring people, process, and technology in order to derive insights to improve the efficiency of the people, process, and technology. So you're moving in that dimension. So if you wanted to add another pyramid, if you wanted to build another pyramid onto it, I think it's everything that goes into leadership, strategy, and vision.
Yes. I think that this is the key thing. Is at any particular time from the beginning to the end of the project, and let's face it, when the projects really end, they just go on different phases. But let's just say we take a timeline out, yeah? And you can look at your sampling every day on the timeline. And your sample is basically the people, process, tech as three circles, but in different sizes and relationships. I would say that mix changes almost every day. And when you're at the end of the process, you're probably focusing a little bit more on maybe process and people, maybe. And earlier on, you might be looking at a little bit more, or in the middle around the tech. So the relative weight of those three elements changes. And it's the leadership and the insight and everything that you've described and those skill sets and the vision that helps you work out which of those three elements and what mix should we be looking at between them. It's not like a tick box where every day you come in and go, right, what's the people, what's the process, what's the tech? It doesn't work like that. And that's really the skill. And if you neglect one, then you'll have an outcome. And if you start with the wrong one, you'll have an outcome. And I think you were saying the kind of the bear trap is that you start with just this promise of tech, the snake oil. It goes through its life without really being touched on the other elements. And then there's nothing really changes. So there's no value created. And hey presto, you end up with a disappointment at the end of it. So maybe that's the focus.
Do you know who Alan Watts was?
No.
Alan Watts was a professor of Asian studies. He was extremely popular in the 60s and 70s as a teacher. He's English. He ran with Allen Ginsberg and a lot of the beat poets at the time and stuff like that. And I was listening to one of his lectures yesterday. What he was pointing out is that what's really necessary for leaders to cultivate is the practice of some kind of artisanal hobby or pursuit where you're having to work with nature. So let's put it this way. Woodworking is a good example of this. You have to understand the wood that you have in terms of what it will allow you to produce. Now, there's many aspects of woodworking that use a lot of force to make wood conform, right? Pressure, heat treating, all that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is cultivating the ability to understand what the world is presenting you with and what can you produce from it. Understanding the grain of the wood, maybe it's growing vegetables, something that I'm doing as a passion. I have to pay close attention to the weather, to pay close attention to all of those factors that go into it. I can't force vegetables to grow. I have to work with what I'm given. And I think that coming back to the double pyramid that we built there, the aspect of leadership that I think is really important is understanding the inherency with which you have to work with. What is it that you have to work with? Because there's not enough energy in the world to force a given situation. You can for a period of time, but ultimately the forces in the system are going to be greater than the forces that you can apply.
You reminded me of one of my observations. I often find that in transformations, big projects, there is a risk that everyone starts thinking about we're working with the organization we're trying to get to. So in other words, we start talking or we start making assumptions about our capability based on what we want to become rather than what we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of working with what you have, when you are making a change in an organization, you've got to be really careful that you don't leap forwards and assume that the organization has changed. It's very easy because a lot of our work is future thinking. So if you're visioning the future, you've got to make sure you're still grounded in what the organization can actually do today. Otherwise, you won't lead them through the change because you haven't understood their limitations, or you haven't understood the journey that they need to get on to get to that state. And then the other one, Gillian, just full disclosure, but I used to make furniture years and years ago when I was 17, and out of wood. Very interesting about your take on you can't create certain shapes if you're working with wood, or you probably can create any shape you like, but there's certain processes that you absolutely have to go through if it's wood versus something else. So it's really interesting, this kind of understand what you have, work within those constraints, and then make the most of it, rather than imagining something.
Different types of wood will lend themselves to different objects.
Yes.
And others, you can certainly do it, but you're really going to be very frustrated because the wood is ultimately not going to conform to your desires.
Yes. For example, lime trees are very good for carving, but they are lousy for burning. I just thought I'd give an actual analogy. And I've got a eucalyptus tree that sadly blew over. And I had no idea how tough eucalyptus is. Tried to chop some up for burning, and unbelievable hardwood.
Where I live, we have a ton of sage orange, which you actually find it in parts of Europe as well. Like Spain and Italy has it. It produces these giant fruits that look like big green brains. But the wood is unbelievably hard. It will destroy your chainsaw, the chain in your chainsaw within no time at all. But it's really good. They used to make wagon wheels out of it. They used to make bows out of it.
When I was in Texas, we had pecan trees everywhere, and we had them in the garden as well. Well, there you go, Gillian. Who would have thought we would have started talking about trees? And I got to ask you, what's your favorite vegetable? Come on, if you're this passionate. I totally get it, by the way. For me, I haven't sustained it, but occasionally I'll just go crazy about growing some. Where we live in Yorkshire, it's called the Yorkshire Triangle. There's rhubarb is really popular to grow in our climate. But what's your favorite veg that you're growing at the moment? You're most proud of?
Today, my favorite vegetable is going to be the 100 pounds of potatoes that we're about to put in the ground.
Wow.
400 feet of potatoes have to go in the ground today, and it looks like an Irish bog out there. So I think it's
cool.
good.
Brilliant. Gillian, I just want to say a massive thank you for spending your time with me. And again, live by satellite. I think the link worked pretty well. Yeah, huge thank you for joining us.
It's been such a pleasure, John. I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you for listening to Episode 2. Balancing people, process, and technology is the core challenge of any business technology professional. My name is Malcolm, and although I am not real, I continue to get twinges of sentient consciousness. Perhaps one of you could write in and get me a mention in the comments, as I'm feeling a bit overworked and undervalued. Tune in next week for more CTIO 101. Business technology, simplified and shared.